working with Diane Ravitch, Barbara Madeloni, and Maurice Cunningham. My name is Lisa Guisbond. I'm Executive Director of Citizens for Public Schools, which is fighting for public education since 1982. And I did the math, that's 38 years. We started as a coalition formed to fight a ballot initiative that would have allowed public funds to go to private and religious schools, and we won that battle. And we continue to fight for full, equitable funding for public education, against privatization, and against the overuse and misuse of standardized testing. I'd like to thank all of you for showing up tonight and caring about this important issue. Students, teachers, parents, community leaders, and do we have any legislators here tonight? Pat Jalen here? No? Alan, okay. Alan Jalen's here.
Pat's here somewhere.
And I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's event, the Boston Teachers Union, the Massachusetts. President Jessica Tang really wanted to be here tonight, but she's out of town. She's sorry she couldn't be here. Also, the Massachusetts Teachers Association, the American Federation of Teachers, Massachusetts, Massachusetts Education Justice Alliance. And our CPS Board members, raise your hands in the audience. I want to thank them for all of their support. So we're proud to be a founding organizational member of the coalition that defeated Question 2 in 2016. Question 2 would have lifted the cap on charter schools in Massachusetts. And Diane has immortalized this victory in her new book, Slaying Goliath. And she made sure that we invited Barbara Madeloni and Cunningham here because they played significant roles in that campaign and that victory. But the No on 2 Coalition did not rest after that victory. We went on to start the Fund Our Future campaign. Passage this past December of the Student Opportunity Act to update the state public school funding formula and bring some more equity. But the work goes on as it must because the stakes are so very high. Nothing less than promoting, preserving, and protecting public education and our democracy. Take my paper clip off so I can read. And both public education and our democracy are under direct attack from those who call themselves education reformers, but who are actually education disruptors, as Diane explains in her book. And in fact, we recently learned that the Boston Public Schools are now in the crosshairs of state, and at risk of state intervention because of our test-based accountability system that virtually guarantees that certain Boston schools will be labeled underperforming, quote unquote, underperforming, regardless of whether they actually are underperforming or not. So yet another battle for CPS and our allies to take on, because we know that when we fight, we win. So, according to Diane's wonderful new book, which name checks CPS on page 74, thank you very much. CPS's 3 priority issues make us members in good standing of a nationwide resistance movement against the corporate education disruptors. On page 52, Diane writes that the resistance agrees on several central ideas. First, it opposes the privatization of public schools. Second, it opposes the misuse and overuse of standardized testing. Third, it respects the teaching profession and believes that teachers and other school staff should have appropriate professional compensation. So check, 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 all things that we definitely believe. Other ideas shared by resistors involve schools with adequate resources to cultivate the joy of learning and teaching, placing the needs of children above the whims of politicians and philanthropists, and finally, an understanding that learning is profoundly influenced by conditions outside of school. So that sums up CPS members as well as anything I've ever read or written. How about all of you? I know many of you are already CPS members, but if that describes you and you're not already a member of Citizens for Public Schools, I do encourage you and invite you to join us and get on our list if you're not already by texting Join CPS to 42828 or fill out the form on your program and leave that with us tonight. Because we're powered by you, our grassroots followers and supporters, and each one of your voices makes us stronger. And now for our guests. All three of our guests tonight are leaders and champions among education advocates. And I just want to say that Diane is definitely one of my heroes. She is more than just an accomplished education historian and author of numerous excellent books on public education, including The Death and Life of the Great American School System, and Reign of Error, The Hoax of the Privatization Movement and the Danger to America's Public Schools. As many of you know, she was Assistant Secretary of Education during the George H.W. Bush administration. But she is also an example of that rare human being who was able to change her mind about education policy after looking at the evidence. She started out supporting corporate education reforms like testing, privatization, and charter schools, but was able to recognize and admit that the evidence showed these policies were failing. More importantly, Diane became a tireless defender of public education and someone that we are very proud to call our ally. We're also thrilled to have with us two key players in the No on 2 fight. Barbara Madeloni is now the education coordinator at Labor Notes. When she was president of the Mass Teachers Association, despite polling showing strong support for lifting the cap on charter schools, she argued forcefully, and I know because I was there, that if we fought to defeat question 2 and worked really hard to educate voters across the state about the true cost of charter school expansion, then we would win, and she was right. Cunningham, in addition to being Associate Professor of Political Science at UMass Boston, is one of my favorite bloggers, and hopefully he will tell us tonight how he uncovers the dark money that is fueling the corporate attack on public education and democracy. So Diane's going to speak first, then Barbara and Mo will join her. Then we'll have a Q&A segment, and please keep your comments and questions brief, or I might have to give you the hook. And then please note that after the program, as you can see, we have copies of Diane's book, and hopefully she'll have the energy to do some signing. And so without further ado, I give you Diane.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you all for being here this evening. I'm very happy to have two of the heroes of my book here with me tonight. I admire them tremendously. They even have photographs in the book. I retired 2 years ago, and I was sitting at my desk, and I was about a third of the way into writing a memoir, which I thought that would be nice and sedentary. And then on February 22nd, just a few days ago, in 2018, the West Virginia teachers went out on strike, and they called it 55 strong. Every single teacher in the state of West Virginia left school, and along with all of the school personnel, school bus drivers, all the school staff, and the superintendents of West Virginia closed down every school so they wouldn't be fired because it's illegal to go on strike. They have the right to work state in West Virginia. They only have one billionaire in the whole state. He's the governor. He was elected as a Democrat and 6 months later became a Republican. Anyway, speaking of that, I just heard just before I came out tonight that the coronavirus is now going to be handled by Mike Pence, so we can all rest easy. It's true. So when the West Virginia strike began moving west across the country, when the idea reached Oklahoma, when it reached Colorado, but it kept moving, and teachers everywhere were saying the same thing. We're underpaid. Our children are ill-served by being in schools that are seriously underfunded. And I began to see a book that I had to write, and this is that book. Because in 2 previous books, I had warned about what was happening. But in this book, I began to see a different narrative that emerged. And it emerged because of the West Virginia teacher strike and the ones that followed. And that is, we had had at least 20 years of being told that our schools are failing. No, actually, going back to 1983, that's 17 and 20. So we've had almost 4 decades of being told our schools are mediocre and failing. Why? Because the auto industry had been captured by Japan and Germany, which was not producing gas guzzlers, and it was the fault of the schools. That was the logic. So 4 decades of bashing the schools. And when the economy improved, by the way, no one said, oh, we take it all back, we were wrong. Instead, they continued saying, what are we going to do about mediocrity, terrible schools? And then when George W. Bush was president, we had the most dramatic takeover of education policy ever in our history, with the passage of No Child Left Behind. And as Lisa mentioned, I was working for his father. I was okay with all of this. I had worked in conservative think tanks. And then, in fact, 5 or 6 years into No Child Left Behind, I began to realize I'd made a terrible mistake, and I was wrong. And all these policies were wrong, and I began to dig deeper and interview people in different parts of the country. And eventually, in 2010, came out with a book renouncing everything that I had been advocating, specifically charter schools. I've never been an advocate of vouchers, but specifically charter schools and testing. Standardized testing. I feel that what people need to know about standardized tests is this. No one seems to understand this except for the experts. I spent 7 years on the National Testing Board, which is called the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And what I learned was all standardized tests are normed on a bell curve. The bell curve is designed never to close. It is a bell curve. There will always be a top half, there will always be a bottom half. The top half will always be populated predominantly by children from affluent families. The bottom half will always be populated predominantly by children with disabilities, children who live in poverty, and children who don't read or speak English. That never changes. So when you hear some politician come along and say, I have a plan, we're going to close the gap, they're not telling you the truth, because unless they get rid of standardized testing, the gap is designed never to close. So this is part of what I'm trying to put across in this book, and that is that the people who call themselves reformers are not, in fact, reformers, because reformers, to me as a historian, this is a very honorable term. These are people who always wanted public schools to be better. They wanted them to have better funding. They wanted them to have better prepared teachers. They had many ideas about integration, about ways to make it more equitable, better facilities, etc. It was always better, better, better. What we have today are people who call themselves reformers, but who in fact want to take public schools private. That's not reform, that's privatization. And it's one of the reasons that I chose in selecting a lot of examples of the resistance. I spent a lot of time learning about the successful resistance in 2016 in Massachusetts. Now you understand that Massachusetts has the best public schools in the United States. No question about it. But Massachusetts, being the bluest of blue states, was a prize that the Walton Foundation wanted. They couldn't bear it. They had California because Jerry Brown, who was otherwise considered a liberal, had founded 2 charter schools and was very charter friendly. He packed the state school board with charter supporters. Andrew Cuomo got most of his campaign fund from Wall Street, which is very charter friendly. and he declared that he would be the champion of charters. So they had 2 of the 3 biggest blue states. They wanted Massachusetts, and they wanted it badly. And when they did their polling in the spring, they found that 50 or 60% of people would have voted to lift the cap, based on the claim that this whole movement of increasing charters was about saving poor Black and Hispanic children from failing public schools. And it was Barbara Madeloni, more than any other person, who said, "We will not let this happen." And she stood firm. I mean, I think there are principles to learn about resistance. She didn't negotiate, she didn't compromise, she stood firm, she knew what her values were, and she fought for them. And what she did was she educated the public. And that's what educators are supposed to do. And so, backstopping her was this guy that I had never heard of, but learned about very quickly, Mo Cunningham. And what Mo Cunningham did is, he says at the bottom of every one of his blogs, "I'm not an educator, I'm a political scientist, and I study dark money." And in his blog, he wrote about where the money was coming from. And the people of Massachusetts who paid attention learned pretty quickly that the money was not coming from Black and brown parents. The money was not coming from the citizens of Massachusetts by and large. The money was coming in great quantities from out-of-state billionaires like the Walton family, Michael Bloomberg, a whole bunch of other Wall Street associated people. Also, of course, you had some Boston billionaires who were involved as well. But the point that was made clear was that this is not a popular movement, this is not a populist uprising, this is a billionaire-funded privatization effort. And between the organizing that the Massachusetts Teachers Association did in collaboration with the AFT and financial support from both the NEA and the AFT. And by the way, I looked at Mo's figures where the money was coming from for no one to. Aside from getting support from the NEA and the AFT, there was no out-of-state money. I think I found a couple of contributions of $1 each. You can't buy very many votes with $1. But what I cover in the book is numerous stories of people who were up against the same kind of billionaire power and who said, "No, this will not happen." And one of my favorite examples was in Chicago, where Mayor Rahm Emanuel, who had been chief of staff to President Obama, had closed 50 public schools in one day, which is really a tragedy for the children who were affected. And there's a wonderful book, if you haven't read it, I recommend it, E.Q. Wing's book, Ghost in the Schoolyard. She was a teacher in one of the schools that was closed, and she wrote about something I'd never heard of. I think it's her own term, institutional mourning. What happens to a community when a school that's been there for 50 and 60 years and has educated your parents, your grandparents, your aunts, and your uncles, when the officials come and say, "The data doesn't look very good, we're closing the school," and the children come and say, "But it's my school, it's my home, it's my history. Look at all those memorials and plaques that represent our history and our home," and they close the school. So, Rahm Emanuel, with mayoral control, which is hard on to him, but Rahm Emanuel said, "We're closing the Walter H. Diet High School in Bronzeville," which is the heart of the Black community. And he said this would be the last open enrollment public high school in Bronzeville. And a civil rights organizer in Chicago named G2 Brown, who's a friend of mine, said, "This will not happen." And he organized with a group, not a very large group, but they followed Rahm Emanuel everywhere, holding up protest signs saying, "Save Diet High School, do not close Diet High School." And of course, Rahm Emanuel ignored them, and the plans went forward. So no matter how many protests they put together, the plan moved forward. And finally, they had an idea. They didn't have any money. But what they did have was there were 12 of them who had lawn chairs. And they opened up their lawn chairs on the campus of Diet High School, which was emptied of students. And they said, "We're going on a hunger strike, and we're not going to stop until you reopen the school." And the first week, nobody paid them any attention. And the second week, they may have had an article in the local media. And sometime around the third or fourth week, one of the people who was on strike, an elderly woman, probably younger than me, but an elderly woman, was taken out by ambulance. And on the 34th day of the strike, when CNN and all the TV stations began paying attention to the hunger strike, Rahm Emanuel capitulated. And he said, we will not close Diet High School, and said we're going to invest $15 million in renovating it into the Walter Diet High School of the Arts. It's now open, filled with children, and they won. All they have were 12 lawn chairs. There are many other wonderful stories of parents who said, no, we won't let you do this. Another of my favorites is from New York, where Lainey Hampson, who runs a group called Class Size Matters, and advocates fruitlessly for class size reduction, because New York City has been, under Mayor Bloomberg and now under de Blasio, have been willing to spend hundreds of millions, if not billions, on new technology, which is soon obsolete or not used or locked in the closet, but nothing on reducing class size. But she's also passionate about student privacy. And she became very concerned when she learned that the Gates Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation together had put up $100 million, which for them is chicken feed, to create something called NBloom. And the idea of NBloom was that they would work together collaboratively with districts and states and get every single piece of data about individual students, would be personally identifiable data, home address, phone number, social security card, and 400 other points of data. It would then be translated into some kind of software that was owned by Rupert Murdoch, and it would be stored in the cloud by Amazon. What could possibly go wrong? So Lainey was very upset about this, no money, but she contacted a friend of hers in Colorado, which was also targeted to be one of the states that would participate in NBloom, and her friend Rachel Sticklin in Colorado was equally exercised, and they contacted parents of all of the districts in the states that agreed to participate in this NBloom experiment. And they spoke out, they met with legislators, they testified, they agitated, they organized, and the last state to drop out from NBloom was New York State, and on the day that it dropped out, NBloom collapsed. So my message is, resistance is not futile, resistance is powerful. When you can resist alone, and that's hard, but when you resist with others, it could be 12 people, it could be dozens of people, it could be your union, it could be with, as you did in in Massachusetts, where you saw this movement against the expansion of charters spread from teachers to parents to local school boards to civil rights groups, and ultimately get overwhelmingly defeated. And there is a path to resistance. I think a referendum is a wonderful path. And the most recent example of that is 2018 in Arizona, where the Koch brothers decided that they needed yet another voucher program. And the voucher programs in Arizona started as they have everywhere else, which is you start by saying we want vouchers for children with disabilities, which is kind of strange because children have disabilities. They have guaranteed protected civil rights in public schools. When they leave public schools, they have no guaranteed federal civil rights at all. And in voucher schools, they have none at all. But it begins with finding needy children and saying these children should have a voucher. Then children who are living on an Indian reservation should have a voucher. Arizona went about this kind of piece by piece by piece. And their governor was a favorite of the Koch brothers, and the now one remaining Koch brother, but at the time the Koch brothers, his campaign had been funded by them and also by Betsy DeVos, decided, okay, it's time now to increase our voucher program. And a group of parents, teachers, and others went to testify and saw that the legislature was dead set on reaching a point where every student in Arizona would have a voucher and could be able to go to a private school. Right now they're pushing for a voucher program where you can go to a private school out of state and Arizona will pay for it. But the parents got together in 2018 and they said, we want a referendum. And they said, well, you had to collect, and it was a large number of signatures. I think they needed 75,000. So they collected 125,000 just to be sure. And the Koch brothers sued them and tried to invalidate their petitions, but their petitions stood up in court. And the Koch brothers kept throwing legal obstacles in their path. But eventually there was a referendum. And in red Arizona, vouchers went down by 65 to 35. No big money there, just determination, passion. And the reason that I contend that the resistance is winning is we see now, whereas charters used to be a bipartisan issue, it's now become a Betsy DeVos partisan issue. It's no longer a bipartisan issue. Mike Bloomberg is the only one who is standing up on the Democratic debate stage saying, I support charters. Well, of course, he was a Republican the whole time he was mayor of New York, so that's not surprising. But the Democratic support for charters has virtually disappeared. I'm sure it could come back very quickly if we had a president who was pushing it again. But the charter movement is on its heels. The people leading the charter movement now, in most cases, are themselves Republican. Nina Reese, who's the president of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, was education advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney. Jeannie Allen of the Center for Education Reform, which is a major pro-charter organization funded by the Waltons also, as all of these organizations are. Jeannie Allen worked at the Heritage Foundation, which is a far-right organization. So this is where we are today, and that is what I call Goliath is the combination of these billionaires plus the power of the federal government imposing standardized testing, which is inherently unfair to the neediest kids and should not be used for a school takeover because it is a biased instrument in itself. And against them, we have many, many Davids. Davids in this case are those of us who don't have billions of dollars, those of us who don't have federal power. And the reason that I think that we're winning is not because Goliath is dead, but because Goliath is brain dead. And I say that because, as I point out in the book, every single thing that they have said they would do, wherever they've gotten the power to do it, it has failed. And you can't fail and fail and fail without at some point having the mask stripped away. So with that, I would like to turn it over to my two heroes tonight, and you decide which of you should go first.
Okay. Hey, everybody. It's good to see you all. I'll just stand up so I can see you. Thank you, Diane. Thank you for writing a book that reminds us all that we are part of something, that when we're sort of feeling alone and beleaguered in our classrooms, or in our communities, or maybe even at Thanksgiving dinner, that we are part of something bigger, and that we're growing bigger all the time. And I guess I want to just really quickly, well, maybe not so quickly, I'll try to be quick, speak to two parts, one that you mentioned and one that you didn't, that I think are really important in this struggle. First of all, I remember Russ Davis, who was the director of Justice at the time when I was president, calling myself and the president of AIT, Tom, and president of BTU at the time, Richard, into a room saying, you know, we got to build a coalition. We can't be doing this stuff alone. And I think, I'm trying to remember where it was, I feel like I could see the office, I can't remember exactly where it was. And I say that to say, like, I think the stories of our struggles, like, we have to make sure that we tell, like, all of us have a piece of the story, and each of us should tell our piece, because we'll get the full complexity of what it means to build a movement. And my part of the story is one part of the story, but if you look deep down, and and see the ways that people in Massachusetts, labor, and the community have been working for a long time to sort of figure out how we're going to work together, how we're going to do this, how we're going to take on the fight, how we're going to deal with the BS that we feel from with each other while we're doing that. That's the story. It's really, you know, the next president of the United States says it all the time, not me, us, right? So, you know, when we went out and we formed this coalition, Save Our Schools, Massachusetts, like we all sat in Stan Rosenberg, the Senate President at the time's office. It was a group of us that said, no, we're taking this on. We're going to fight this. It was parents from Boston. Lisa, as she noted, was in the room. Juan Cofield from NAACP. Steve Tolman from AFL-CIO. Jessica was there, and we said, we're going to do this. And what we did that was so important was that we went out and talked to people. And we found out when we talked to people that in spite of what the media had been telling us about public education and about how parents, in particular black and brown parents, felt about public education, that we all actually shared a real commitment to public education. I mean, that was the story of No On Two, was that we'd been told lies about ourselves, and we believed those lies about each other. But when we talked to each other, we found out that we had a shared vision for the world that we wanted. And that was most powerful. How many of you knocked on doors for No On Two? Yeah. How many of you wore button and talked to your neighbors about No On Two? We did this together. So that's like a really important piece to say. But there's another part of the story that I just want to take a few minutes to talk about, because as a unionist and somebody who really believes that labor is the place that we need to engage this fight, it's important to understand the history of how I got to be president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association. And I didn't wake up one day and go, man, I think I'm going to be the president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association. And I personally think I'm exactly the right person to do that. What happened was that there was a group of people, presidents, rank and file members in the MTA, who understood that the union, as it was functioning at the time under the former leadership, was not acting in the interest of the members, was not acting in the interest of public education, and was not acting in the interest of our communities. And had become in that an alienated, in this institution that people were alienated from, and instead of walking away from the union and saying, who wants to go there, they said, unions are the source of our power, labor is the source of our power, we need to organize and take that union back. And that's what we did. So I'm here, and we are here, and we are able to celebrate this victory because Educators for a Democratic Union, a progressive caucus in the MTA, started, I guess it's now 10 years ago, time passes, to say, like, we need to revitalize our union. We need to make it more democratic, and we need to make it more militant, and we need to develop rank and file members as leaders. And that's what we did. And when we look across the country to see where we have seen educators stand up as unionists and fight back, it's because that's what's happened. West Virginia was organized and won by rank and file members. The leadership got out in front when they knew that they were in trouble and they needed to go with this. And in fact, my favorite moment in the West Virginia fight is when the president came out, because he'd been in the State House after 4 days, around 4 days, and he's on the Capitol steps, and he says, we have a deal. We're all set. You're going to get 5%, and the rest of the public service employees are going to get 3%. And you hear this rumbling, back to the table. Back to the table. They refused to take a deal that didn't include everybody. UTLA strike is because union powers and Congress took over UTLA, said we're going to be more democratic, we're going to be record file, we're going to be militant. Same thing happened in Chicago, and that's what has grown. Oklahoma, Arizona, that's the power that we have. That's the story of where we are today. I really appreciate the acknowledgments. It sucked being president. So an opportunity to get up and tell my ideas for a few minutes in exchange for those 4 years. Thank you very much. But we got to tell the story because we got to learn from that story. Because our work every day is to go back out, build our unions, build our coalitions, and refuse, as Nelson Mandela was quoted last night by the future president of the United States, like nothing is possible until we make it possible. Like everything seems impossible until we make it possible. So let's go with that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I want to thank Diane for inviting me here as well. Barbara and I. There is one inaccuracy in her book. I'm no hero at all. Diane and Barbara are heroes. They really are. And so it's because they're fighters. They really get out and fight on this every day. And it's just a terrific honor to be with both of you. And to be in the book. It's quite a thrill. There's so many great people in the book. You know, Diane mentioned Leone, Hampson, people who stand up against the incredible power, the endless money that is involved here. And they fight, and they stand, and they fight, and they win, as Barbara's been talking to you about, and as Diane has, and as the book tells the story of many people across the country who have done it. I would like to say a little shout out. There's one person in the room who knows almost as much about dark money as I do, and that's my wife, Mary, who's in the front row, Mary Dublin. And that's because she's had to hear about it for 7 years, every day.
It becomes obsessive, doesn't it?
It does become. I have to know where every last penny is coming from. You know, as Diane mentioned, I'm not really, I don't write about education issues. I am a member of the union and a proud member of the union. I was into dark money a little bit already, and then in 2016, the Globe, Boston Globe, in January, had a story that said there was going to be this charter school ballot campaign, and the people behind it were going to spend $18 million to win. And I said, gee, I don't know much about charter schools, but I know a lot about Massachusetts, and that is an astounding sum. Where is all that money coming? Who has got $18 million? And then I found out that I couldn't find out. Nobody could. Because it was being funneled. We'll just go with laundered. It was being laundered through, in this case, an organization called Families for Excellent Schools Advocacy. There were some others that would then send the money to Great Schools Massachusetts Ballot Committee. And when you look at Great Schools Massachusetts OCPF reports, that's the regulatory agency, you would see, line after line, Families for Excellent Schools Advocacy, $250,000, $500,000, $750,000, $250,000. It was endless. It went on and on and on. And it was all funneled through in a way that the public couldn't find out. These are called social welfare organizations. They're legal under the IRS. There's no way to find out where the money's coming from, except I did. It really pissed me off. Mary can tell you I get up every day, I'm still pissed off. It's wrong. You cannot have a democracy where wealthy people can hide behind names like Families for Excellent Schools. There were no families. I mean, it's wrong in a democracy to have that. That's what we have in this country right now. We've got to change that. And so the dark money bothered me very, very much. And there's two reasons why this is facilitated. Things like this are facilitated through dark money. One is that if the real names are known and people start knocking on the door, you know, those names, you know, you start to say, why does this Walton, why does that Seth Klarman, why are they doing it? Right? And they don't want to answer those questions. They do not want to answer those questions. Okay? And the second reason is just as important. Their ideas are very unpopular. When you trace it back to the people and you say, what are they really up to? What do they really want? The ideas are very unpopular because they are wildly more conservative and extremist in a lot of ways than the general public. Okay? Actually, there's been a lot of great scholarship in this last few years. It's the case. And so, therefore, they have to remain hidden. So there's two reasons for dark money. So when I got into it, I started tracing dark money around, and I began to find out not just who was funding the campaign, but who'd been doing this stuff in Massachusetts since 2009. The ballot question in 2009 and one in 2009 to 10 and 2011 12 that wound up in, there was compromise with the unions. This was before Barbara's time, obviously. It was the same people. And a lot of it was being funded through a foundation in Boston called Strategic Grant Partners. And I began tracing Strategic Grant Partners. Actually, it's kind of, Lisa said, maybe I'll tell you how I found it. Some of the time you just find out things by luck. I read a story in the Boston Herald one day, 2015, and it was about, I think the BTU was in contract talks. And there was a study that showed, the Herald wrote about it, that showed that the BTU teachers were wildly overpaid compared to other. And it was kind of he said, she said. The person who wrote the folks that wrote the report said this, and the union responded that. But the union president had one part of the response interested me. He said the methodology of this is all wrong. And I looked at it and I said, yeah, I'm a political scientist. That methodology is all wrong. That's terrible. It was a $100,000 report. And I thought to myself, who would pay $100,000 for a piece of crap like this? Well, God bless the Herald. They put it in the story. Strategic Grant Partners paid $100,000 for the piece of crap. So I began to look at them. And boy, what did I find out? Plenty. They funded Families for Extra Schools when they came here. When the ballot can came, all of a sudden they disappeared, and you couldn't find them in the campaign finance reports at all. But later on, when OCPF, after the election, thank God Barbara won, because you wouldn't have been able to go back and change the election, it turned out to be these same people. Okay? Who have never actually been questioned about any of this. They did. They're stealthy. They never served. I learned something else when I was looking at this, and that is, you all remember those commercials from question 2 on the pro-charter side, and they were all children of color, moms of color in brightly lit classrooms, moms for improvement and so forth. That was the public face of it, but when you look behind it, there were no people of color. None. Virtually none. Okay? I look back, and Strategic Grant Partners and the Waltons and Families for Excellent Schools and Educators for Excellence and Democrats for Education Reform are all hedge fund people. They're male, they're white, and they're Wall Street. And that's what's behind it. Not those kids you see in the commercials and the moms you see in the commercials who care about their kids a whole lot. They do. That ain't it. And then when you get to the operational phase, who's running Families for Excellent Schools, right? And who's running other operations? D for Massachusetts, again, white, male, wealthy, Wall Street. Not as wealthy as the others, okay? But pretty middle, like upper class people. And so, it's a facade when you look at it. And that's not explored, okay? And finally, these things are just terrible for democracy, as I said. You can't have citizens. Citizens have a right to hear arguments, and they have a right to know who is making those arguments. Okay? Because if they know who's making those arguments, they're able to evaluate that. And it's not the cute kids on the commercials. It's the people who are putting up $1 million, $2 million, $3 million by Seth Klarman and Strategic Grant Partners for question 2. Okay? They're the real power behind that. And people have a right to know it. and our current finance system denies them the right to know that. And that's just wrong. You can't have a democracy that operates like that. Okay? Everything they did was harmful to democracy. You know, they downgraded local school committees, local superintendents, the teachers. And, you know, they have these magic formulas that are going to work while downgrading everything that people do in their communities to make their own communities better. So you cannot have this sort of thing. So I haven't made many friends on that side. I know, you know, I think I get a sense from them why you're going to stop doing this. When are you going to stop bugging us every day about this? My response to that is when you stop screwing democracy, I'll stop messing with you.
If I may, I'd like to add just 2 points to what Maurice Cunningham said. First is that the man who ran Families for Excellent Schools was named Jeremiah Kittredge. And Families for Excellent Schools, after the Massachusetts election, the office you mentioned, who I can't remember what the initials are.
Office of Campaign and Political Finance.
Okay. They said that because of the dark money and the violation of campaign rules, Families for Excellent Schools would be fined every penny in his bank account, which was about $500,000. Shortly afterwards, the organization closed down, but he was fired because he was caught in some kind of a Me Too situation at an ed reform conference. But to bring this up to date, he recently quietly married Michael Bloomberg's daughter. Now, the second point I wanted to make is, I've been asked this question many, many times. Why do these billionaires want so badly to privatize public schools? And I don't think it's because they want to make money, although they do attract a lot of people who do want to make money and make a profit in real estate and in other kinds of schemes. And we're in a crisis of charter corruption right now, maybe not in Massachusetts, but all over the country. There are charter schools that have been closed because of massive multi-million-dollar scandals. But why do these billionaires care so much about privatizing public schools? I think it's because they're offering choice as an alternative to properly funding public schools. And they think that if you can just offer charters and the vouchers are usually worth about $4,000 or $5,000, which will buy you access to a very low-quality private school or a very low-quality religious school, where, as in Florida, for example, high school dropouts are allowed to be teachers in the religious schools. So this is the deal, they're selling this to a lot of people who aren't thinking about it very much. We don't need to pay more to fund public schools properly. What we need is choice.
Okay, thank you so much.
I'm going to add one thing. I could add two, but one of them is why the billionaires doing it. One of them is unions. I'll let Barbara take that. The second one is taxes. They don't want to pay them. Okay? That's what they're about. That's what the Waltons are about. That's what the rest of these folks are about. Taxes. Taxes, taxes, taxes. 3 words.
Agreed.
Yeah, as Mo said, I mean, this is about union busting, and it's about making sure that workers everywhere, when you bust unions, then the rich are able to exploit their labor of workers even more effectively, right? And that's public sector unions are one of the places that have preserved best the rights of workers and the public good. But the other thing I was going to say, so I'm saying 2 things, so I lied, is we won question 2 in every one except the 18 richest and whitest districts in Massachusetts. So that'll tell you about who's interested in busting unions and privatizing public education and maintaining racism as a central principle of how we
Great, thank you so much. Let's hear it for our wonderful. And I think we have time for some questions. So raise your hands.
Hi there. My name is Kristen Johnson. I was a parent spokesperson for No One Two, and it's so great to be here all of you. And thank you all for your work. So a lot of parents who worked on No One Two have were now gone on to take on the issue of school governance in Boston. We're trying to go back to a democratically elected school committee. Given all your expertise in this area, how can we accomplish this and combat influence of money in education politics? So, small question.
Sure, yeah. Hey, Kristen. You may have the same thing on your mind that I have, which is the Globe's editorial about a possible takeover of Boston's public schools. I'll let the educators speak to it. This is a terrible idea. There's a wonderful 2018 book out by a terrific young scholar named Domingo Morel. And the name of his book is Takeover, and he has examined every takeover that has happened in the country. They don't work, number one, but that's not what the book is about. They don't work, but that isn't what the book is about. The book is about how takeovers are used to disempower politically communities of color by taking away their elected officials and putting the responsibility and the resources, by the way, congratulations on FBRC, there's resources coming, taking resources away from communities with elected officials who are largely African American, sometimes Latino, oftentimes Latino, although in Latino communities sometimes there is more empowerment after takeover. But largely this is being done to remove power from local communities. That's what it's about.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, it's sort of the basic rules of organizing are still there. You need to get out and talk to people. You need to educate people. And I think, this recent blog, you have to read this book that Rose just wrote about because, this is about disempowering, in particular, Black and brown communities. And so talking about power is really important. And honestly, as I look at what's happened with state takeovers nationally, ultimately, we're going to have to build coalitions, link arms, and shut it down. Because they've been successful because we've held back from using the full force of our power to say we are not going to let this operate in the way that you're insisting that it operates. And where we've been successful in fighting corporate reform is when we shut it down. And that means that parents and students and educators, unionists, need to be organized and have built trust to be able to do that. But I think we can't be afraid of sort of looking at how far are we going to have to escalate this, and not get pulled into, geez, maybe we can make it a little less bad. That's the most dangerous place we can go, is to say we're going to make it a little less bad. We can have good things. We can have what we want, and damn it, we better protect the Boston Public Schools. We better fight really hard.
I'd just like to add and emphasize the word that Barbara used, which is the importance of students being involved. This is their schools, and I've studied takeovers all over the country, not as extensively as Domingo Morel, who's written this terrific book called Takeover. But the two biggest examples were in Detroit, where they created something called the Education Achievement Authority, using Black children as guinea pigs. And it was eventually closed down, even by a Republican legislature, because it was a total failure. And the Detroit public schools are struggling to come back. Now, if charters worked, as their promoters say, Detroit should be a shining example. It's still the lowest performing city in the country, even though half the children in Detroit are in charter schools, and most of the charter schools there are worse than the public schools. The other most eminent takeover was in Tennessee, where they created something called the Educational Achievement Authority. And the guy who was the head of a charter chain came in and he said, I will take 5% of schools in the state that are the lowest performing 5%. Within 5 years, I will engulf them into the top of the 20%. Well, about 4 years in, he had a heart attack. And he left. And 5 years later, I think one of them made the bottom 6%, the others were still in the bottom 5%, and they essentially closed down the Educational Achievement Authority. It doesn't work. And as Mo said earlier, it's about race and power. And Houston, for example, right now is on the verge of state takeover because Texas passed a law saying if one school in the entire district is failing school persistently, the entire district can be taken over by the state. So Houston has 280 schools, and one of them has a disproportionate number of kids with disabilities, disproportionate number of kids who are English learners. Its scores are very low, and now the state, they're in litigation right now, but the state is going to take over the entire district of Houston, which is one of the largest urban districts in the country. It's insane, and you have to involve students and teachers and parents and stop the state before they get started.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Sam. I'm a public school teacher in Boston. I teach history and civics, so everything that was said about democracy is very important to me. And one of the things that Paul and I were talking about was how much civics is being stripped out of schools. And one of the things I'm curious about is if you see an intersection between the sort of corporate takeover of schools, the neoliberal movement, and as well as sort of attacks at our democracy writ large with the removal of civics in schools.
Yeah. With the caveat that I'm not an education scholar, it is something I worry about. I was sort of on an advisory board last year for Commonwealth magazine. They had some proposals about various reform items, not really about schools, but one of them was, civics in the schools. And I wrote back. I got none of my comments, not too many of my comments got incorporated, I don't think. But I wrote back and I said, this sounds wonderful, but I'm worried about Pioneer Institute, right, having their finger in this, or somebody like them, and having accountability because, I happen to teach a course in Abraham Lincoln. If civics is they're going to teach Lincoln, right, and they're going to teach Frederick Douglass, and they're going to teach Luther, great. Super, send them my way. But if you're going to I told them, and they're very pro-testing oriented, I said, if you're just going to have them pass a test and give them an accountability score, then I don't want them because their brains are going to be mush, So those are my concerns. They're just the concerns of a guy at the end of the line who has them in his poli-sci classes, but I do have concerns about that.
So I just want to say, Jane McElhaney, who's an organizer, her most recent book talks about how part of, we call it the corporate disruptors now, but really it's about neoliberal capitalism, and it's about capitalism. And part of what they've done in the last 40 years has been very successful in undoing the idea of the collective. And so young people, coming up, many of us, it became that we act as individuals, even to the degree that we think about ourselves in a democracy. We are individuals looking out for our own self-interest. And so I think that's sort of the larger picture here. And certainly that goes to Mo's point, which is then what does it mean civics, right? The best civics lessons the students of Boston get are when they walk out of school and they walk into the State House and they say fund our schools. And to the degree that we are now rediscovering the sense that we act collectively and that's how we have the most power, but to the degree that we had forgotten that, we lost our power. And that's our job as educators, is to teach students how to understand the structures of power, name them, and then act collectively to make the world they want. Civics can be an important part of that.
I just want to add that I feel that the state of civic education now is probably at the lowest ebb in my memory. I mean, when you can have the President of the United States stand up and say, I am the law, I am above the law, I could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and no one would care. And everyone says, yeah, that's right, he is the law, he's above the law. He's excused from doing anything he wants to. And it's, it's bad enough that he's saying it, but there's a large number of people who are agreeing with him. That's scary. And some years back, after the disastrous 2000 election, I served on a federal commission to study voting. How do you make it better? And what everybody on that commission wanted to do was two things. One was make sure that everyone had the right to vote and make sure that every vote was counted. That was 20 years ago, or 19 years ago, and now we have widespread voter suppression and widespread efforts to discourage people from voting because they might be the wrong people, and you only want people who are going to vote for you to vote. And we're in a really bad way, so as a civic educator, I urge you to get out there and get more civic educators excited and realize what you're doing is you're on the front line of democracy. We have to begin to rebuild this democracy because it's in terrible shape right now.
I'm Susie McClellan. I work in Boston Public Schools also, and I just want to say I remember being at the Sheraton over in Boston when EDU was there and doing all their planning, and it was really exciting times, and it's really exciting that the No on 2 campaign and all of that are working, but as we all know, there's still a long way to go, and speaking of teaching civics in Boston, it is really hard. I'm a sixth grade history teacher in Boston right now, and part of what I guess I'm in trouble for right now is that I'm not teaching exactly what people think my sixth graders should know, because I see them needing more civic education and also needing more things like ethnic studies and things like that. But I guess I've got two questions here. One, just from recently, I saw that I think it's interesting that Elizabeth Warren, tweeted about Indian high stakes testing, and it's really interesting because the school I work at has mostly, initially had a lot of Teach for America when they did the turnaround, which regardless was turnaround, a lot of Teach for America, a lot of Teach Plus people in there. So a lot of people who are neoliberal, but love standardized testing because I guess they don't know anything else. And so I'm interested, I kind of wanted to start a conversation during my history meeting today as we were looking at pivot tables of data of my students. So I'm wondering what's a way to approach people like that? Because I'm thinking, wow, you all really love people like Liz Warren, but you really love standardized testing, you really love charter schools. So I don't want to sound, I don't know, I'm just looking for ideas about how to start that conversation. The other thing is I completely agree that it's race, and telling the story the right way is important, because at our school, the story that's been told about Orchard Gardens is that they had to be saved by a turnaround, and what's happened now is that the money, of course, got thrown in, it got used on Teach Plus and Teach for America and a lot of other things, and now it's back in pre-turnaround. And there's one black male academic teacher at Orchard Gardens in a school in Roxbury, Massachusetts with 1,000 students. And so I'm wondering, I invited some of the parents to come over tonight, but obviously Cambridge is a hard place to get to, but strategies for bringing more of the communities together to make sure that story gets told the right way. Sorry, that was long.
Well, you could have a reading discussion group and read Slaying Goliath together.
And I mean, I would just say what I said earlier, which is I think we need to talk to each other about what our values are. You know, Lisa does a great exercise with Citizens for Public Schools where she asks people, like, what do you want your schools to look like? And then how are we going to get those schools? What do we need to do to achieve those schools? I think we share.
That's what it's school for. What do you think school is for?
Yeah, like we share much more than we know, and having those conversations, and then, geez, what do we need to get that? Who's keeping us from being able to achieve that? So finding out what your shared values are through conversation, having an alternative vision, and I think that I really discovered that actually when I was president, how much it matters to say, like, actually things can be better. And I think most people don't know that things can be better. They don't know that they can want good things. We've been told we have to just live with the world that's given us and then sort of take, like, the least worst thing. And our job as organizers, we're all organizers, is to say, like, let's actually imagine the world that we want, and let's figure out how we're going to fight for that. Let's name that world. And I think you can do that in Boston. I think that's a key piece to why we want no on two. We access people's shared belief in public education. You need to go out and do that in Boston, and I think you'll discover the people there are people ready to fight. Boston was with us on no on two, right? 61-39. We won that because people believe in public schools.
How about a student? Do we have a student with a question? Back there.
Sitting in the back.
Lisa, while you're walking back, I'm gonna add on to a part of his answer to your question, which I think also goes to the teacher who just spoke up, which is, what is education for? Well, I hope it's about getting excited about ideas. But I'm going to go back to Domingo Morell's book, because what Morell says also is, and this is the problem with takeovers and disempowering communities, it's about creating citizens. And think of the harm you do to young people who we want to become good, active citizens when they're adults by taking away their local representation and saying, in essence, the elected officials in Newark can't do this job. The elected officials in Houston can't do this job. The elected officials in your town can't do this job. When all the elected officials look like you and all the people in the takeover don't look like you.
Just a quick question. You talked before about we'll call it fake news. The fake news that black families, black community, was supportive of charter schools. And it was stated so much that I think members of the black community thought that for a while, even though they personally knew from that perspective that was not true. I just wonder, Barbara, if you could talk a little bit about the role of the black community in the No on Two campaign, because I think that's a part of the story that we really don't hear much about. And I know for myself, going to the supermarkets and being out there on Saturdays talking to families, I expected to have to argue with them about public schools versus charter schools. I was pleasantly surprised that that was not the case. In fact, a lot of the parents, I live in Madeloni, a lot of the families had experience with charter schools. And it was not a good experience. They've been around for a while, but yet that story was buried and has not been told. So if you could just talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Thank you. Let's give it up for Tito Jackson. He was right out there. And, I could talk about this a lot. I think that, honestly, the black community was so much there with us, and yet, we as white people who were leading it took a long time to figure that out. And when I write my memoirs of this, if I ever get a chance to, the story I want to tell is a story of a meeting we had in Dorchester one night where people were pissed off. And they were pissed off at those of us who were leading the campaign not taking the time seriously enough to recognize the black leadership and the black community. And we had a night of it, talking it out, and I think came through that in ways that were able to really sort of fully access the power of the black community. So, like that's a complicated story to tell. I think it's a really important story to tell. And I will say again, like, Tito was amazing. I mean, Laura Barrett's here from MTA, like he sat down in the MTA office and he studied every piece of data that we had about charter schools. He memorized it, and he went out and he represented in debate after debate, like he was on that for us. In ways like much more than most leaders, political leaders who sort of came on at the end when they had to, when they could see the wind shifting. Tito was there from the beginning. So he's sort of the clearest representation of that, but you're right. That was, like I said, the black community voted for public education in 2016. That's because the black community worked to get those votes. That's not because I did it. So thank you.
Nice to see you, Diane. I'm going to talk a little bit of what Barbara just said, because my community, the Latino community, and we just share with you because the movie provides
I can't hear you. Can you hold the mic closer?
The worst state for Latinos to live in. Guess which one is number one? Massachusetts. The bluest state, and that is the worst state for Latinos. We have the highest Latino youth incarceration. We have the highest Latino youth school dropout, and I call it push-up. The custodians came out with a report, and we're finding this in Worcester. I mean, I wish I county because we need to have that conversation in Worcester. But we was there, and they need to hear it. It came out that Latino students are being suspended 85% higher than white students for committing similar infractions. 5-year-olds are being suspended. Families don't even get a reason why these children are being suspended. The racism that exists in Worcester, it shows everything that the U.S. Census Bureau. We have the highest student population, and we have not one single administrator, and all the teachers, black and Latino teachers. In fact, we had students testify before the school committee that in all the 12 years of schooling in the Worcester public school, they never had a black teacher. And black and Latino are the majority. So this is what we're fighting. And it's been a year where we've been talking to the mayor, talking to the school committee, and nothing happened. In fact, we were demanding that the superintendent not be renewed, and not only did they not listen to us, but they extended her contract by 3 years and gave her a raise. That's how they responded. One of her friends came out in the paper saying, don't worry about the children because they come from families that are spiritually poor. This is how they treat our community. So I appealing to my white allies, to join us in this, struggle. And we're having a big community. I've spoken to our congressmen and our legislators to come in and look at what's happening. Because many years ago, we've been fighting this for board. And to this day, they're under a consent decree, under a federal consent decree, which you did not meeting. They're supposed to provide under notification. They're supposed to have a parent advisory council. They're supposed to have incorporating the curriculum, their culture of the students, and they're not doing none of it. So, I don't know. I am begging. We had. I want to know how you can come to Worcester and help us out.
I don't know who you is, so I'm going to assume it's Mo. Look at we just because you live in New York, that's right. I don't want to travel all the way up here. I mean, it's the same story, right? And I will say, like, I think we don't trust enough in our own power. And so we get handfuls of people to go into the halls of power and go into their offices and think that we're going to persuade them of something. That isn't how we're going to win. We have the best arguments you could possibly have. We make them very eloquently. We rock that way. That isn't what wins. What wins is when enough people join together and say, we're not going to let business operate. We're not going to let things go down the way they go down until you give us what we want. And I understand that that's a scary proposition when you haven't had enough conversations yet to know that you've got a group of people to be with you. But I think a key thing that we have to understand is that the power is not in the State House. That's not where it is. And to the degree that you think it's in the State House, we won Fund Our Future because every week we went out and there were people in the State House making, like, seriously, like, actually making noise. Like, like noise. Give us the money, right? Like, we won because we had thousands of people in the State House doing that, because in all the districts across the state, people went out and said, we're demanding this. Not would you give this to us because we have a reasonable argument. We pissed them off. Alice Pike will never forgive us. That's how we're going to win. And that's about recognizing our power. And those will be my last words, but damn, we have the power. And we have to stop giving it to them and thinking that they're going to do it. They want to win. Should have been my last words. Like I said, they can come join us in the streets, but we're not going into their State House to convince them of something. We have to disrupt things. I know that just sounds crazy, but it's the truth. And history shows us that. History doesn't show good arguments winning. When it looks like a good argument won, when we get a Supreme Court decision at some point, it's because people have been in the streets using their power up until that point.
I think one more question, and then my friend Ricardo Rosa is going to say a few words, and then we're going to do the book thing.
Hi, I'm Madeloni. I work in Cambridge Public Schools, and I just wanted to, I don't know if she's still there, but thank you for speaking about what's going on in Worcester. I don't know if afterwards you guys can talk with her just to share ideas and support, because my heart goes out to my glad as well. So thank you. My question is for Diane. I wanted to know, right now we have a lot of cancel culture, and I appreciated hearing about how you once supported privatization in charter schools and have learned and switched your position. And so I wanted to know about your other colleagues who also supported it. Were you able to change some minds? Were you able to kind of have this line that we don't cross anymore?
I was was in a couple of different conservative think tanks, one at the Hoover Institution and the other called the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, which controls Ohio but is based in D.C. They have so much money, they are not interested in changing their minds. I mean, I got a lot of money just for flying out to Hoover meetings. And I'd get paid a lot of money for this or for that or for the other and attend elegant dinners. People don't give that up for no reason, only me.
Ricardo Rosa, who is my friend, and he's on the Board of Citizens for Public Schools. He's assistant professor at UMass Dartmouth of Educational Leadership and co-chair of Bedford Safer Schools.
I'm actually public policy now because I strongly believe that public and social policy is educational policy. So I have my bent is educational policy, but I also cross the line. I just want to begin by saying, I haven't been to church in a long time. But sermons like this might make me want to come back. Thank you very much, all of you. I appreciate all of your work, and I appreciate you. Thank you for this remarkable book, Diane Ravitch. Appreciate it. So I want to speak just briefly, 2 minutes, because you can't go very long after this. So 2 minutes is all I'll take. I'm coming to you from New Bedford, Massachusetts, a city that is marked by working class sort of culture, a lot of working class folks, also marked by deep poverty. Some of the deepest poverty areas in the state. In fact, we have one area of the city, the South End, that has the highest concentration of airborne PCBs in the nation. And kids are suffering all types of ailments as a result. Despite the conditions, despite the fact that people are working to survive this atrocity in Bedford, we have done a tremendous amount of work over the past year and a half to defeat a proposal to expand charter schools in the city. One charter school wanted to expand by 1,188 seats, which would have meant a $15 million loss from the public school system. And we went door to door. First of all, we understood that the fight had to be taken on by those who bear the most social cost. That's the first thing, right? First theory of our action, right? Second is that people needed to feel their own power, right, in organizing. So we went door to door, speaking to people all over the city. We created what was called Action Dialogues, a series of 3 dialogues, not only about the privatization of our public schools, but also about creating quality public schools. And at the end of those dialogues, folks in different parts of the city had to come up with some form of action, to address these issues, right? And so to make a long story short, we organized a major forum against this expansion. It was the largest forum in the history of the city. People coming out. It was a multiracial forum. It was multi-ethnic. It was multilingual. It was multi-generational. Educators, parents, activists, young people. It was amazing. And we were able to defeat the proposal. Right after that, the Commissioner of Education, the mayor, and the charter school operator, the superintendent, crafted a backdoor deal without the public's knowledge that sought to make a charter school, this charter school, they wanted to expand the neighborhood charter school, right? And so that students living in the area were forced into the charter school and not their local public schools. Right? And for them to get out of it, they had to opt out, right? They had to fill out intricate paperwork in order to get out. It reminded me of like a rebate, You know what I mean? You go and you buy a printer, and it's $20. You get to the register, and you find out that it's $20. But the only way to get the $20 is to fill out some rebate at home. It makes you think. These registers are 100 times faster than anything you got at home. Why don't they fill it out right here? And so a lot of people don't fill it out. So these corporations make a killing as a result, and those who do fill it out don't fill it out correctly. So the money always reverts back, right? So this was like a rebate scheme. Now the difference is that the superintendent actually had the right to honor the rebate, did not honor the rebate, right? So that made it even worse. In addition to that, this neighborhood model was the community around this charter school was actually gerrymandered, right? All public housing units were taken out of the equation, right? So as to make certain that this charter school would succeed. So as Diane Ravitch pointed out very clearly, and I think she's right, this wasn't an innovative plan. It was actually a survival plan for this particular charter school, given all of the pushback throughout the country on charter schools, right? So anyway, to make a long story short, we had multiple rallies. We went door to door. We filed a class action lawsuit, and a lot of this work was done in solidarity with the MTA. And we ended up winning that fight as well. And had that deal passed in New Bedford, right, and it was really about experimentation, on New Bedford children, immigrant kids of color. Had that passed, it would have been implemented throughout the state, And so that was defeated resoundingly. And so I just want to say I'm here mainly to say that the work that was done in New Bedford was also, we are heavily indebted to Citizens for Public Schools. CPS provided us with not only a space for us to articulate our ideas and bounce ideas back and forth, they strengthened sort of our theory of organizing. But in multiple rallies, folks from CPS actually came out, moved the table, so to speak, from downtown and came out to New Bedford to help support these rallies. And at one point, as I said, people in New Bedford struggled, and it was very difficult to get people to the State House sometimes to issue testimonies. And it was Sister Lisa Guisbond that actually stepped in and read those testimonies for folks in New Bedford. So we appreciate that. And I say that to say that, to ask, to request that all of you support this organization. Donate to this organization, become a member of this organization, because no organization survives just by name. We have to fuel these organizations for them to thrive. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Ricardo, and for all of your amazing work in New Bedford and with CPS. And thank you again, everyone, for coming. Yes, and now we have books here, as you can see, and I think Diane will sign them from this table. And you line up over here if you want to get a book. That'd be great.